Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
My sister's surprise party got more guests than my wedding, including my parents. I wish that was an exaggeration, but it's the kind of story that still makes people pause mid-conversation and ask if I'm joking. It started as one of those perfect mornings, the kind that feels too soft and bright to belong to real life. I was sitting in the hotel suite with my bridesmaids, the air smelling like hairspray and nerves, my dress hanging near the window catching little halos of sunlight. My heart was racing, but it was the good kind of anxious, the kind that comes when you've waited years to feel like your life is finally lining up. Ethan, my fiancé, was downstairs getting ready with his groomsmen, probably laughing too loudly, trying to act calm. Everything was in motion. The photographer arriving, the florist calling, the makeup artist powdering my face, until my maid of honor froze mid-sentence and said, "You need to see this." She was holding her phone, and on the screen was my sister Sophie's Instagram story. The caption read, "Can't believe my friends pulled off a surprise birthday party for me. Love you all." There she was, in a sparkly dress, surrounded by balloons and people holding champagne glasses. I blinked, thinking maybe it was an old video, something from years ago. But then I noticed the date in the corner today. My wedding day. The time? Exactly 30 minutes before my ceremony. I laughed because it felt absurd. Sophie was 27, dramatic, impulsive, but this was a new level of self-centered even for her. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mom. "Sweetheart, something's come up with Sophie. She's having a bit of a crisis. We might be a little late, but we'll try to make the reception." I remember just staring at it, waiting for the words to rearrange into something that made sense. A crisis? At a surprise birthday party she was clearly enjoying? I typed and deleted my reply 3 times before just locking my phone. My makeup artist, trying to help, said softly, "It's your day. Don't let anyone ruin it." But I could already feel something breaking, quietly and permanently, under the surface of all that gloss and lace. By the time I got to the small chapel I knew, the seats reserved for my parents were empty. So were several others, family friends who'd RSVP'd weeks ago. The air felt heavier than the dress pressing against my ribs. I walked down the aisle anyway, my hand trembling on my own arm because my father wasn't there to give me away. I smiled for the photos, repeated the vows, and kissed Ethan, trying to focus on him, on the promise, on anything that didn't feel like abandonment disguised as inconvenience. After the ceremony, one of Ethan's cousins whispered to him that she'd seen pictures of my sister's party. Half the guests who were supposed to attend our wedding were there. I could almost hear the sound of my dignity collapsing inside me. The reception felt like a play staged for an empty audience. People tried to cheer me up, telling me that maybe my family would join later, but deep down I already knew they wouldn't. The DJ kept playing upbeat songs that made me nauseous. The photographer tried to get us to cut the cake, and I did it mechanically, holding the knife as if it were some symbol of control I didn't have anymore. Then my phone buzzed again. A text from my mom, "Don't make this about you, sweetie. Sophie didn't mean any harm. Family comes first." I stared at those words for a long time. My husband was talking to someone, smiling nervously, pretending not to see me swallow whatever emotion was left. That was the moment I knew that this day, the one I'd spent a year planning, was never mine to begin with. It was just another stage where I'd been told to play quiet while my sister performed. Later that night, when the guests left and the venue emptied, I walked outside barefoot, the hem of my dress dragging through the dirt. The air smelled like rain and distant perfume, and I thought about how ridiculous it was that even the sky felt more loyal than my family. Ethan came out and wrapped his jacket around my shoulders. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. We both knew that whatever had happened that day wasn't going to be fixed by apologies or explanations. Some things are too deliberate to be accidents. In the weeks that followed, Sophie never called. She didn't text, didn't ask how the wedding went, didn't even pretend. My parents posted a photo from her party with the caption, "So proud of our amazing girl. You deserve every celebration." Every like on that post felt like another confirmation that I'd been erased from my own family story. Ethan tried to distract me with weekend trips and dinners, but there was a kind of silence between us that kept growing, the kind that comes from knowing your partner married someone who's quietly grieving something she can't explain. People always talk about the big betrayals, affairs, lies, money, but what they don't tell you is how small betrayals can slice deeper. A text message, an empty chair, a laugh in the wrong place. That's what I remember most from that day, the absence. It wasn't the missing guests or the cold food or the forced smiles. It was the realization that love, when it's conditional, feels exactly like standing in a white dress with no one watching. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, standing outside that venue, barefoot, humiliated, with Ethan's jacket slipping from my shoulders, was the day something in me quietly changed direction. I stopped needing to be understood. I stopped waiting for apologies that never came. I started planning a different kind of life, one where silence wasn't punishment, but protection. And somewhere deep down, beneath all that pain, a new thought started to grow, not revenge, not yet, but something colder, steadier, the beginning of distance that would, years later, become the one thing my family could never forgive me for. I learned quickly that there is a difference between forgiving a family and letting them keep their hands on the steering wheel. So after the wedding, I did the grown-up version of vanishing by degrees. I stopped picking up calls that opened with rehearsed sighs. I let text messages stack into a narrow column of blue bubbles I never tapped, and I took the petty advice of an older coworker who told me that sometimes the healthiest boundary is an address no one knows, which is how a one-bedroom apartment 2 states away became the place where I started to breathe without asking permission. Ethan tried to be the bridge, and for a while I wanted to let him, but every time he started a sentence with, "Maybe your mom meant," I felt my throat harden and my shoulders lock. And after a winter of trying to outtalk the ache, we both realized that the marriage we had built with good intentions and discount linens was more fragile than either of us wanted to admit, so we sat at a kitchen table that still smelled like cardboard tape and said the kind of things people say when they want to be kind while breaking something that cannot be fixed, and although the paperwork took months, the marriage itself ended in a single long exhale that sounded like two people finally telling the truth. I didn't make a dramatic announcement about any of it, because in my family information is a form of currency and silence is the only bank that never bounces. So when my Aunt Margaret called out of the blue and said she had seen a photo from my wedding where I looked like a woman trying not to cry through a half smile, and then asked whether I might come stay for a while at the vineyard she and my Uncle Henry ran in the rolling nowhere outside a town with one blinking traffic light, I said yes. With the relief of someone being offered a place to put down a heavy bag, not because I needed the scenery, but because I needed to be loved by someone who didn't have an agenda disguised as concern. Aunt Margaret had that particular warmth that old-school women carry like a skill, the kind that appears in a perfectly buttered grilled cheese and a blunt observation delivered with a wink. And within a week, she had me waking early to walk the neat rows of vines while she told stories about underestimating late frosts and overestimating men with strong handshakes, while Uncle Henry limped out of the barn smelling like oak barrels and laughed in a way that said he believed time could fix more than therapy if you gave it enough honest labor. Life there organized itself around useful repetition, morning checks for mildew and rabbit damage, afternoon calls with distributors who always wanted a better price, evening tastings where I learned that a good Pinot can forgive a sloppy day if you treat it right. And somewhere inside that rhythm I began to understand that I had built my entire identity around being the reliable daughter who absorbed shock so other people could perform drama, and that maybe the most radical act available to me was not forgiveness or confrontation, but competence without apology. I slept better, I ate the kind of food that tastes like someone thought about it, and I wrote exactly one email to my parents in which I explained that while I was safe and working and not interested in rehashing the wedding, I expected no more triangulation through Ethan, because he and I had separated and he deserved a future that did not include my mother asking for updates as if I were a missing package. They responded with a paragraph that looked like concern until you parsed the punctuation, and then the old choreography began again with suggestions for quick visits and casual lunches halfway between us, but I did not nibble at the bait. And when their disappointment finally hardened into criticism, I performed the smallest and pettiest revenge I have ever allowed myself and still consider perfect. I mailed them a framed 8x10 photo from the wedding of the two empty front row chairs, with the place cards Mom and Dad catching a strip of sunlight across the seat, and beneath the image, I had the framer etch a neat brass plaque that read "Reserved," which was so pointed and so polite that even I laughed when I slid it into the box with the soft tissue paper, and though I never received acknowledgement, a cousin later let slip that the frame had been placed face down on the buffet and then quietly moved to the attic, where I hope it hums like a smoke detector they cannot locate. Aunt Margaret, who saw all of this without requiring the commentary, showed me how to prune the stubborn canes that steal strength from the main line, and while we worked she told me that every family has a drought year that exposes root systems, and that you can learn more from a parched season than a lush one if you pay attention, which is why she surprised me one evening by handing me a thick set of folders and saying that if I ever wanted to learn the business properly, she would teach me. The parts most people hide, like the lopsided invoices, the short-term loans that only make sense if you believe in next year's harvest, and the legal nonsense that protects a lifetime of sweat from one narcissist with a pen. I said yes, because it felt like choosing a life instead of running from one, and while we worked through those papers she watched me in that way older women do when they recognize a familiar scar. And she said without ceremony that blood is just a delivery system and that love chooses a different door. By spring I was taking calls, sending samples, balancing books, and standing shoulder to shoulder with my aunt under a warehouse van while a vendor tried to explain why his half-fulfilled order should be billed at full cost. And when I finished slicing through his excuses and closed the deal at a price that made Uncle Henry wink over his coffee mug, my phone pinged with a message from Sophie that read, in its entirety, "Heard you're working with grapes now. How cute. When can we come visit?" Which was as close to an apology as she could manage, and as far as I was willing to let her get. I set the phone face down on the stainless table, wiped my hands, and decided that my next petty masterpiece would be administrative rather than sentimental. So I created an auto-reply for all family emails that thanked the sender for their interest in vineyard tours, provided a link to a public booking calendar with only weekday dawn slots available, and included a note that said closed-toed shoes were required and drama was not permitted on the premises, which made Aunt Margaret laugh so hard she had to sit, and which, predictably, no one in my family ever used. One evening, when the sky over the vines had the color of a bruise healing at the edges, Aunt Margaret leaned on the porch rail and told me I reminded her of herself at my age, which I took as flattery until she added, "With that quiet mischief I learned to trust." That stubborn girls who refuse to be erased should always have a contingency plan, because families like ours only change costumes, never scripts, and then she patted my hand and said that as long as she had breath, I would never go hungry in this world, a comment that settled into my chest like a secret I had not earned and could not yet understand, and that would, soon enough, turn the quiet life I had built into something loud enough to wake the dead. Grief has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of a life until even the ugliest memories feel muted, yet when the call came in late autumn that Uncle Henry had slipped away in his sleep and when, before the frost had lifted, Aunt Margaret followed with a stubborn quiet that felt like a door clicking shut, I discovered that sadness can live beside clarity, because while the neighbors brought casseroles and the vineyard workers shuffled their caps and spoke in those careful half-whispers people reserved for the newly orphaned, I moved through lists and signatures and flower orders with a focus I recognized from emergency rooms and border crossings, the mind narrowing to a single beam that makes every task look solvable as long as you keep moving forward. I drove the old truck to the church with order forms in the glove box. I pressed my palm against the eucalyptus wreaths to test their weight. I wrote an obituary that spoke plainly about a marriage that outlasted bad harvests, and I created a seating plan that would spare me from the performance my family always treats as worship, because I knew they would come late and dressed to be seen, and I wanted a strategy that would honor the dead and guard the living. They arrived with the confidence of people who have never been told no, my mother in a cream coat that would photograph like sympathy and my father holding his chin as if sorrow improved his posture, Sophie in a dress too bright for the weather. Pausing just inside the doors so the room could register her before she moved, and for a moment the part of me that had once begged to be chosen stirred, but then the ushers, who were vineyard guys in borrowed ties and sturdy shoes, guided them to the side aisle reserved for late arrivals where the view was narrowed by a column and a floral stand, and because I am not made of stone I took a breath and let relief wash over me in a small and private wave. During the service I told a story about Aunt Margaret carrying a flashlight through the rows during a spring frost and how she would breathe on her knuckles and say that showing up is the only prayer that works every time. And the sanctuary hummed with the recognition of a truth that does not demand applause, while the slideshow flickered with images of harvests and holidays where my parents were conspicuously absent, not because I had scrubbed them from the record, but because cameras can only capture what is in front of them and afterward. As mourners offered those ritual phrases that feel like towels placed over cold hands, I watched my mother's mouth tighten the way it does when she notices a center she is not occupying. The reading of the will took place in a conference room that smelled faintly of toner and old carpet, with a lawyer whose voice had the trained flatness of a man determined not to become part of the story. And as he unfolded the thick pages and began the recital of bequests, there was a small rustle from my parents' side of the table that suggested expectation dressed as humility, while Sophie scrolled her phone with the bright restlessness of someone composing the caption for a post she has not yet earned. He listed personal gifts to longtime workers, a scholarship fund for 2 local students who had stacked crates in August heat, a donation to the volunteer fire station that had once saved the toolshed, and then, in language both simple and irreversible, he declared that the estate in its entirety, including the vineyard, the house, the land, and the accounts, would pass to me. Not as a surprise, but as a continuation of a plan drafted years earlier and updated after each growing season, a plan that included a line Aunt Margaret had insisted on inserting in her own unmistakable cadence, stating that the estate should belong to the person who had consistently shown up when showing up mattered, which was both a legal clause and a benediction disguised as bookkeeping. For a full 10 seconds the room was perfectly still, and then Sophie laughed, that thin laugh she uses when she is trying to make discomfort look like comedy, and my mother composed her expression into a look that blended pride and concern. A face she has worn at bake sales and hospital rooms, and she reached across the air with a voice tuned to the register of reconciliation to say that families are complicated but love is simple, and that perhaps, now that the past had sealed itself behind us, we might honor my aunt by doing what she would have wanted, which, according to my mother, meant hosting a celebration at the vineyard to reset the story, a phrase that sounded less like grief and more like branding, and then she floated the notion of a second wedding. A proper ceremony with vows and flowers and family in the right seats, so that we could all make things right and move forward as if the first ceremony had been an unfortunate rehearsal rather than the moment my life split down its hidden seam. I did not answer immediately, because the revenge I have learned to prefer no longer looks like a shouted line in a crowded room. It looks like a paper cut placed exactly where pressure will open it again and again. So I turned to the lawyer and, with grave appreciation, asked him to read aloud the letter Aunt Margaret had left for me, sealed in an envelope with my name written in the tidy script she used for shipping labels, a letter that he opened with deliberate care and began to read in that same steady voice, telling the room that she and Uncle Henry loved me as a daughter, and that the vineyard should remain a place for work and honest joy rather than a stage for old performances, and that any celebration held on those grounds must be hosted by me, paid for by me, and shaped to reflect the values of people who show up, which sounded like a simple instruction until the lawyer reached the final paragraph that I had asked him to include in the reading, the one in which she thanked my parents by name for having taught me exactly what absence costs, a line that landed without theatrics and yet accomplished everything I needed, because my mother's face did that small, fast collapse a seasoned actress cannot control when the script is taken away. My father looked briefly at his hands as if searching for a tool that would make this moment compliant, and Sophie, seeing the center vanish, closed her mouth over whatever post she had been writing, while I folded the letter back into its envelope with the calm of a woman who has finally learned that sometimes the kindest and cruelest answer is the one that echoes the truth. When we stood to leave, my mother touched my sleeve and said, almost tenderly, that we would talk soon about dates and florals and guest lists and all the ways a second wedding could heal a family that had merely drifted. And I smiled in a way I had practiced among barrels and invoices, a patient shape that contains both yes and no, and told her that we absolutely would talk. Because if there is one lesson Aunt Margaret taught me better than pruning it, is that a promise made to a person who has never listened can be a very effective mirror, and as the door of the conference room clicked shut behind us, I knew I had already set the first stake for a celebration my family would not see coming. A gathering designed to honor the dead by finally telling the living who they are. When the estate lawyer filed the last certificate for probate and the condolence flowers turned to potpourri on the dining table, the calls from my parents began with an earnestness that would have sounded touching if I had not already heard the same instruments in a different key, because suddenly my mother had discovered the language of accountability. My father practiced regret like a speech before a civic club, and Sophie posted a carousel of sunlit throwbacks in which she tagged me with captions about sisterhood and healing, as if the algorithm could bless what history had not, and while neighbors tell me I should have hung up every time the phone lit with their names, I learned long ago that controlled access is a stronger lock than a welded gate. So I answered, and I listened, and I told them that if we were to do any kind of second wedding, it would follow a few basic rules that protected the estate, the staff, and my sanity, rules which I delivered cheerfully and in writing. Because paper outlives moods and memory. I said the event could be held on the vineyard grounds only under a permit I secured, that all vendor contracts would be signed by the party proposing the celebration, that alcohol service would end before sunset because harvest crews start before dawn, and that any speeches would be vetted for length and tone to avoid the sort of cheap theatrics that make grief look like a pageant, and I placed these terms inside a pleasant email that thanked them for their thoughtfulness and linked to a shared folder titled Logistics, which they opened immediately and scrolled through like tourists studying a subway map seconds before boarding the wrong train. They seemed delighted to have assignments, which gave me the freedom to curate the parts that mattered. So while my mother argued with a florist about hydrangeas that never last in heat and my father auditioned string quartets as if he were choosing a national anthem, I met quietly with our field manager to schedule a volunteer morning for the day after the celebration, during which guests who wished to honor the family would spend a few hours staking young vines and packing donation boxes for our scholarship fund, and I signed purchase orders for sturdy work gloves in neat sizes and for donation forms printed with Aunt Margaret's line about showing up, and I set aside a table for our crew and their families where the place cards read simply, "Everyday people," because I wanted my relatives to understand the difference between an audience and a community without my having to deliver a sermon. Invitations went out with calligraphy that made even the worst intentions look dressed for church, and because Sophie could not resist a headline, she told an acquaintance at a lifestyle blog that we were redoing the vows on a grand scale, which produced exactly the kind of press they craved and exactly the kind of pressure I prefer, since attention becomes accountability the minute you turn the lights up. I let them choose a cake tall enough to cast a shadow and a rental tent that looked like a white sail when the wind came off the hills, and I approved a guest list that conveniently excluded the people who had commented, "So proud of our amazing girl," under Sophie's birthday post on my original wedding day, because a door can be closed without announcing the hinge, and I created a seating chart that placed my parents at a center table surrounded by folks who had worked a harvest with me in 90-degree heat, people who do not clap for well-delivered half-apologies, and who know the value of water in August, and for favors I ordered small engraved brass plaques that read "Reserved," mounted on walnut. A quiet echo of an image I had already mailed once, tucked into velvet pouches with cards explaining that the plaque was a reminder to save a seat for those who show up when it counts. During one planning call, my mother suggested an open mic, which I declined with the gentle reasoning that Unplanned speeches are where sincerity goes to faint, and she laughed as if I were teasing when I told her we would instead project a short video during dessert that captured the spirit of the vineyard and the values of the couple who built it. Because I had found in Aunt Margaret's desk a thumb drive labeled with a single word and a date that preceded my arrival by a full season, a drive I had not yet watched to the end because restraint is a tool, not a virtue, and timing is the difference between a story and a strategy. As the weekend drew close, the house filled with the restless electricity that precedes spectacle, rental trucks sighing up the drive, workers anchoring the tent with the precision of a field surgery. And in every corner of the property, small decisions hummed with the power of implication, from the choice of string lights that stopped before the family table to leave their faces in a slightly plainer glow, to the playlist that replaced syrupy nostalgia with the old blues Aunt Margaret liked when the vines were heavy and the sky threatened late rain, and beneath all of it I felt the slow burn of something like justice, patient and unsentimental, the kind that makes you smile at the exact moment someone mistakes your silence for surrender. On the night before the event, while I was reviewing the run sheet and finalizing the donation boxes in the office off the porch, Sophie slipped in with the stealth of a teenager arriving after curfew, and she stood there in a silk robe and slippers and the urgent expression of a person staring at the wrong end of the narrative, and she told me that our parents were counting on me to be generous, that if I refused to share the estate they would see her as the reason, that I was better at surviving bad optics, but she was not, and that I should do this one kind thing for the family because healing requires sacrifice. Her words were almost persuasive because they were aimed at the version of me that once begged for entry, but I have learned to translate panic into plain speech. So I put down my pen and told her that I had already shared more than she knew and far earlier than anyone realized, a statement that wiped the relief from her face and replaced it with calculation, because she could not tell whether I meant money or secrets or something she had already broadcast without reading the caption. And when she finally whispered what exactly I had shared, I just smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, just with the finality of a boundary that has finished being negotiated, and said that tomorrow, when the lights dim for dessert, she would understand, and that whatever happened after would be exactly what each of us had earned. By the time the sun stretched itself along the rows and made the netting glitter like 1,000 careful promises, the white tent had become an idea people could step into, with the string quartet nudging sound through the canvas walls and the servers gliding as if they had trained in some quiet ballet, while my parents greeted arriving guests with that proprietary smile people reserve for holidays they did not actually plan. And I moved through the prep with a clipboard and a practiced calm, because I had learned that if you want a spectacle to land exactly where it should, you have to feed it every detail it will later choke on. Which is why the seating chart placed my parents in a sweet spot that looked central until the lights dimmed and no spotlight reached them, and why the favor table waited at the exit rather than the entrance so that every guest would carry home the little brass plaque etched with the word reserved, and why the run of show tucked the dessert course directly before the video, because sugar makes honesty feel like something your body can survive. The officiant, an old friend of Aunt Margaret's who wore a linen suit and a mischievous expression, stood ready at the small arbor we had wrapped in clipped vine and late roses, and people assumed we would reenact vows because the invitation, crafted in my mother's voice but approved in mine, had promised a renewal of something lost, yet the program held a single line under the heading ceremony that read "Words of Dedication," a phrase that seemed to soothe and unsettle in equal measure, and that tension hovered like summer heat waiting for a storm. When the string players softened to a hush and the quartet's leader gave me the slightest nod, I walked to the front with the slowness of someone setting down a delicate box and thanked everyone for coming with a voice that borrowed steadiness from the hillside. And I said that in families like mine the word celebration is often a costume sewn quickly over a bruise, which is why I wanted to begin not with vows that ask to be believed, but with something that simply tells the truth. And then I turned to the screen that hung from the ridge of the tent like a sail and signaled for the lights to lower, and the video that Aunt Margaret had recorded in the cool spring before I arrived opened with the steady image of her at the porch table, hair tucked under a cap, hands folded in that practical way she had when delivering instructions worth following, and she spoke in the unadorned sentences she trusted during frost warnings, saying that the vineyard belonged, by design and by law, to the person who had shown up when showing up was not convenient, and that she hoped no one would mistake inheritance for a new seating chart because what they had left was not a palace, but a tool shed full of well-oiled implements, and in the second minute she explained, with the farmer's affection for paperwork that saves futures, that she and Uncle Henry had placed the estate into an irrevocable trust named for the motto they liked to mutter under their breath during tough harvests, which meant that the land, the house, and the accounts could not be sold, siphoned, or repurposed to serve any story other than community and work, and that distributions would flow in three directions only: wages to the crew, scholarships to 2 local students each year, and operating funds approved by the trustee, which was me for as long as I showed up and did not embarrass the vines. There was a visible shift in the tent, a kind of quiet that follows the sound of a door bolting against wind, and before anyone could fill it with the old script my mother preferred. The video continued with the paragraph I had asked the lawyer to preserve and I had chosen to project in full, where Aunt Margaret thanked my parents for teaching me early that absence is an expensive habit, and where she said, without malice and with unmistakable precision, that if love ever arrived dressed as urgency, the vineyard would offer work rather than a spotlight, because work was the only apology that fed anyone, and as the footage faded to a still of the rose at dawn, the lights rose just enough to show my mother's hand closing around her clutch in that reflexive way she has when the bill comes and the waiter is standing on the wrong side of the table. I let the quiet settle before I spoke again, and I said that when Sophie had come to me the night before and pleaded for a share because she could not afford the optics of losing, I had told her that I had already shared more than she knew, and now I explained what I meant, pointing toward the volunteer sign-up boards along the back wall where the names of invited guests had been pre-filled with time slots and tasks for the following morning: staking, boxing, cleaning, and toward the donation station where every glossy place card, when flipped, included a QR code that sent contributions to the scholarship fund with Aunt Margaret's line about showing up printed above the confirmation, and toward the table where our field manager sat with union pamphlets and a notary stamp, ready to help the crew sign paperwork that guaranteed wages tied to profits rather than promises. And I said that this was the only kind of second wedding I could accept, a ceremony where the vows were made to labor, to students, to mornings that come too early and stay too long, and that anyone who wanted to bless the union was welcome to pick up a pair of gloves on their way out. It was the neatest revenge I have ever executed because it used their hunger for a photo to feed a ledger instead, and for a handful of seconds I believed the evening might end with a complicated kind of grace. Yet families like mine do not retire quietly, so my mother stood and began a speech with the word misunderstanding, a term that has functioned for decades as her solvent for consequence, and she reached for the microphone, only to discover that it no longer lived on its stand because the officiant, who had taken the measure of the room with a farmer's efficiency, had already walked it to the back where the crew's table sat. And there a woman who had tied vines with me in sleet cleared her throat and said that the trust would do just fine, and that if anyone needed a picture to remember the day, it should include a shovel, which drew a laugh that did not mock so much as release, and my father, seeing the center slip, muttered something about propriety and stormed toward the exit, while Sophie, an artist at the pivot, grabbed both my hands and repeated the word family with a brightness that asked for a bridge I no longer built. People drifted, as people do when the air changes, and some guests signed up for morning work without fanfare, and others left their favors behind, as if the weight of a small plaque were more than they had budgeted for the evening. And when the last of the quartet's cases clicked shut and the generator coughed itself into silence, I stood under the arbor with the officiant, who asked in a low voice whether I wanted a benediction to close the ledger, and I said that I wanted something smaller and more honest, so he nodded and, with that half-smile he wears when the weather cooperates against the odds, pronounced the day dedicated, which sounded exactly like enough. Later, Long after the servers had stacked chairs and the hills had pulled the temperature down into the pocket where breath turns visible, I found a letter tucked beneath the donation box, printed on my mother's stationery and written with a restraint that fooled no one, saying that they did not understand me but that perhaps they had never tried, and asking whether the trust allowed room for something like forgiveness if forgiveness presented itself dressed as work. I folded the page and slipped it into my jacket without deciding what the answer should be, because ambiguity, I have learned, can be a door rather than a wall if you leave the handle within reach, and the next morning, when I walked the rows with a line of volunteers, I noticed that one of the names on the clipboard had been scratched out and replaced in a careful script that looked like someone trying not to be recognized, and I did not look up to see whose hands were in the soil beside mine, because some truths grow better when no one forces them into the light, and because, for the first time in a very long time, I felt the day move forward without asking me to choose between justice and peace.